first and foremost to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters on which we here at the center work and live in Townsville, the Bindal and the Wuguru Kaba peoples, and honor their elders past, present, and emerging.
Great, thanks so much, Brock. And it's my pleasure to introduce Shankar Aswani. Shankar is one of the sort of real pioneers of sort of maritime anthropology. He's been working in the Solomon Islands in Melanesia for about 30 years, and has worked on a whole range of topics, from real sort of core human ecology, looking at things like optimal foraging theory, to much broader social ecological interactions. You know, the hallmark of his work is that it's often really theoretically grounded in anthropological thought. Shankar was actually one of the first people I ever collaborated with. After I finished my PhD here, I wanted to write my literature review up into a paper. And so Shankar had been working in the Solomons on traditional management issues for a number of years at that time. And so I kind of cold called him. I contacted him out of the blue and asked if he'd want to collaborate with me on this paper. And he said yes. And it turns out that I guess two good things happened out of that. First was that I got one of my most cited papers out of it. I think to this day, it's still probably my top 5 or so most cited papers. But it also spawned a great friendship. And so Shankar and I have been in communication since then. And I've had the chance to visit him quite a few times and vice versa. So that was one of the great things. And so for the students listening, there's always some value in kind of reaching out to people that are at the top of their game in your field, and reaching out and connecting with them on that. And for me, it's paid off both professionally and personally. So with that, I'd like to say, Shankar, thanks so much for agreeing. I know it's very early over where you are, and you're not much of a morning person, so I appreciate the extra effort there. And I'm really looking forward to your talk. Thanks, mate.
Well, thank you for having me and inviting me, and thanks to Iron for organizing this and for inviting me to give a talk. And for you, Josh, of course, we've been friends for 15 years now. So I am very glad to be able to give a talk. So thank you everyone for hosting me and having this Zoom talk. The reason I am giving this talk is not that advanced in some new theoretical anything. It is really a collage of, let me unmute the video because my thing is not going well. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is not like a theory. It is a collection of things that we've been doing in anthropology, in human geography, environmental sociology, and other archaeology and other disciplines that I've seen somehow wither over the years, and I don't know why. I mean, maybe I'm not reading the right literature, but I scope most of the literature and I see a decrease in this. So about a few years ago, I decided to write this paper. This talk is based on 2 papers that I'll show at the end if anyone wants to read them. One I wrote for ecologists, and the other one I wrote for anthropologists. So they are published already. So you can always go there and look at much deeper analysis and thought. So I'm going to talk about something I call coastal human ecology for environmental management and conservation. Okay. So let us go quickly over what I'm trying to go through. Look, human ecology, I said, is not a theory, but a set of approaches that have been developed in anthropology and human geography and other disciplines really for the last 60 to 70 years. And in fact, I find myself sometimes reading things from the 1950s and 60s, which I think are wonderful, really in-depth, really theoretical. And sometimes nowadays with, the quick publishing that people go through all over the world, we kind of, I wouldn't say that we've forgotten about these traditions, but there seems to be a different scope of what people are doing. And I'm a little bit of a classist in this way. I was trained in sort of classical human ecology. So it's been, I've been involved in a number of things that, as Josh has mentioned. And in the last 7 years, I've been working in various African countries. And even here in Africa, there's been like a jump from these traditions to these new views like socio-ecological systems, work and so forth. So Let me continue, and just to give you a little bit quick background. If you see I have an accent, is I'm actually originally from Spain, even though my name is an Indian name. My father is Spanish, but of Indian descent, and my mom's Spanish. So if you don't understand something I say, just let me know, and you can interrupt me. But anyway, let me get to the talk. Again, coastal human ecology is a study of how humans adapt biologically, cognitive, culturally to their ecosystems, especially the marine ecosystems, and how they transform them, change them, ecologically, socioeconomically, politically, and so forth, and how those changes dialectically kind of fit into human adaptation in those environments. So looking at this whole dynamic going really at the local scale to some way. So I think a lot of the things we're going to really be talking about today, it's about scale. So again, coastal human ecology in this respect is what human ecologists have always been doing, which is studying, these very close ecological interactions with humans and ecological communities, and again, looking at how that transforms societies and people alike. So in sort of broad terms, coastal human ecology seeks to answer proximate causation questions, the how, and ultimate causation questions, the why. And the why would be sort of the foraging theory, human behavioral ecology, behavioral sciences. And I think, Josh, you wrote a paper not so long ago I think in Nature Science, in which you had a piece about these behavioral sciences and how important they are to kind of look at cognition in people behavior, cooperation, and stuff like that at a micro scale level, because then we begin to understand sort of human dynamics. And there's a vast literature on this, on human behavior. But in this case, we're thinking about coastal human ecological interactions. We are all worried about the sea and its conservation and its management, proper management. So we all dwell in different ways of how we can think about this. So quickly, well, and this is not to challenge socio-ecological systems thinking, because at the end, I think I'm going to try to talk about how these are actually compatible rather than, at odds. But there are kind of differences, in socio-ecological systems, which is the ruling paradigm today in environmental social science and environmental science per se. You have CHE, which is a much more local focused, and SES does local, but also regional and global. Field time is long-term versus usually more short-term. As an anthropologist, we think that the minimal time period that a student should spend in the field is about a year. And even that we have almost a shifting baseline in our own discipline, that where students think they can go for 3 months and get all their data right up, and that's it. I've come to the conclusion that there is no shortcut. And that's really pertinent when we come to think about management and conservation. So field time, it's long-term versus short-term. Units of analysis, we are more actor-based, although as you will see, there's a lot of variability here. Socio-SES looks at systems. Theoretical scope is neo-Darwinian, although not exclusively, but it's part of the different set of approaches that look at human behavior. Whereas in SES, you have systems, resilience, vulnerability, a lot of the observation, the methodologies of observational behavior and perceptual, where a lot of SES relies on perceptual data. You do, a rural assessment, or you do whatever in the ground. You ask these questions about changes and things that are people doing, how they're adapting and coping with different changes in their environment. In the coastal human ecology tradition that I'm talking about here, you have much more involved observation and behavioral data recording. And if you go to the ancestry, at least within an anthropological context, the coastal human ecology will be much closer to, culture, ecology, as per Julian Stewart, versus the ecosystems approach, more close to Roy Rappaport and ecosystems approach in anthropology in the 1960s. So actually, I don't know if any of you have delved into that literature, but do so, because you will be you'll be shocked to see some of the stuff and how methodologically meticulous some of the work done on these things, either in cultural ecology or ecosystems approach to anthropology, were done at the time. So anyway, I'm trying to provide a sort of a starting point. So quickly, I'll just go through some of the topics that are relevant here, and then I'll give some examples of my own work to kind of provide an idea of how do we actually execute these kinds of things. So quickly, we have, maritime interactions across space and time. We're talking about archaeology and coastal adaptations, vast literature in Africa, in Asia, in many parts of the world, in the Mediterranean. Also the study of indigenous navigational systems and trade networks. Historical ecology of fisheries that some of you have been involved with, also an interesting area to look at. So in this case, history does matter, right? And we will get more into particular studies that actually look at what things can you do. Please give me 1 second. I need to get a little bit of water. So, all the areas, ecological and economic behavior in marine environments, human behavioral ecology, and evolutionary ecology of marine foragers. In fact, I wrote my whole dissertation on that topic. Experimental economics in fisheries, looking at the example public good games and stuff like that, and looking at cooperative behavior in fisheries. Again, a micro scale kind of experimental research. Other sort of larger areas that are common in anthropology, human geography, more of the kind of ethnography of fishing societies, cooperatives, and so forth. So you have ethnographies of fishing communities, coastal marine tourism, example work of Mark Miller and other people have been working on this stuff for years. The political ecology of fishing and aquaculture. I think not so long ago, Nathan Bennett wrote a piece on political ecology and fishing societies, also an important area. Coastal food and livelihood security and sovereignty. Again, I think there's a lot of people cooperating with you, Josh, working on that area. Marine knowledge and governance systems. These are areas of importance. And as you can imagine, marine local knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge, territorial systems and co-management, marine protected areas and social and ecological impacts. And then we get back to the sort of the more SES, socio-ecological systems kinds of paradigm, climate change, and so forth, marine interactions in complex adaptive systems as a larger theme. And this, of course, is marine socio-ecological systems, environmental and climate change, and coastal vulnerability, and proximate and distal drivers of resource use. This is actually one area that suggested to me by Josh when I was writing these papers. So again, another important area to study. Just quickly, this is kind of a figure that I developed quickly to kind of express, and all of these themes are related to what I call coastal human ecology, but some of them much closer. And I think it comes back from my sort of anthropological human ecological interest. And as you see, the thicker arrows that get closer to Che are the ones that are closer in terms of ecological, in terms of a theoretical and methodological tradition within coastal human ecology. So this gives you an idea of all the topics I've been talking about, which seem to occupy the entire space of a lot of the research we do in coastal systems. So I wanted to also make sort of a historical analysis in some ways, which are closer to coastal human ecology and which are not as close, but are also of interest. And a lot of this stuff is published. So again, if anyone wants to go to a deeper understanding or analysis of what I'm saying here, you can go there. So I'm just going to quickly go through some examples of my own work to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of methods you can use and the kinds of things that you can do in terms of its relevance to conservation and environmental management, which is one of the focus of JCU and many other institutions nowadays, to find solutions to sort of the environmental crisis we're living in today, all across the planet, but especially in coastal and marine systems. And just quickly, Josh mentioned that I've worked in Solomon Islands, and I've worked in Solomon Islands for 30 years now, but I've also worked in various areas. I've worked in Hawaii, the Marquesas. I've done paleoecological research in the Marquesas. I've worked on Tongan ethnohistory, a little bit on Palau. And in the last few years, I've been working in Africa, and now I have various projects in South Africa, Madagascar, Tanzania. Tanzania very involved the last 4 years. A new project in Macaronesia, working in El Hierro, in the Canary Islands, and Seychelles, also one of our new areas that we are starting a new project on marine conflicts. So yeah. So let me just go to some of the areas that I talked about when we studied, when I talked about human coastal ecology, and the relevance to the conservation management part of the story. So we talked about history at the beginning, and we talked about archaeology. So let's talk about, for example, ethnohistory and marine tenure and governance systems. So you can do stuff like ethnohistorical research. You can do genealogical demography, family mapping to look at relationships of people. And then you can actually map that, georeference that information and have it in terms of spatial patterns of settlements across time. That is important to understand territorial moves of different peoples across the landscape and seascape. Why? Because different tenure governance rights are molded by those historical movements of people. As you see, again, you will see the emphasis of all of this is sort of micro or local centric research at looking at what's going on the ground. And as you may imagine, that history does matter for conservation. As you know, in case of the work I've done in Solomon Islands, by understanding population trends and their movements across space and time and spatial distribution, that gave us a very strong sense of stakeholder distribution in terms of marine property claims and governance systems. Again, I think that you would all understand that in this case, history does matter for conservation. In other areas, and this is just a picture of sort of this is actually going back to the work of Edward Bidding in the Morova Lagoon, but similar here in the Roviana Lagoon, where I've worked for 30 years, looking at sort of the local conception of the landscape and seascape, and how people conceptualize their environment. You can do institutional cognition and governance, and that involves things like, for example, I've done cultural consensus analysis to look at cognitive cultural models of people. And interestingly enough, we found out that even though these people are sharing a language and a culture, depending on what area they lived in the lagoon, their cultural model of governance was somewhat different, and you can get at that through psychological anthropology, cognitive anthropology methods, and things that actually exist today, and they have been in anthropological research for more than 50 years. But again, I feel that, and I think one of the reasons I'm giving this talk is that a lot of these kind of traditions have somehow withered over the last 20 years. Again, study conflict and natural resources, and this you can do with standard questionnaires and interviews. Experimental economics, looking at cooperative behavior between people, and propensities to cooperate. That is very important if you're thinking of developing management regimes and working with local people in co-management or some kind of, creating locally conceptualized marine protected areas or whatever. So this kind of information can provide you some information on group cohesion, conflict, and the likelihood of cooperative behavior. So by understanding sort of the cultural models that people have in their heads in terms of current governance and management decisions, is very important and very much relevant for conservation and environmental management. Again, you can do work on socioeconomic transformation and coping strategies. I've done quite a lot of work on that, looking at income and expenditure analysis through questionnaires, diaries, direct observation, and so forth. looking at gender asymmetries through questionnaires, differences between men and women in terms of tasks and work and perceptions and so forth. A lot of work on time allocation, looking at how people use their time. And that is not just asking them, what are you doing? Because often when you do more systematic studies like using spot checks and time diaries, you realize that what people are telling you they're doing on a weekly basis, which you would capture in sort of a perceptual kind of questionnaire, doesn't really correspond with the real way in which people actually allocate their time across a whole year. And this is why I'm talking about the micro or locally centered research projects, because when we do these rapid assessments and questionnaires and ask people about how many times a week they fish, how many times a month, we just get snippets of their moment of the mind they think about when you ask the questions. So often the responses that they give are not very, I wouldn't say real, but they're not, they are not very objectively grounded in the reality of their own behavior. So when you do these long-term on the ground research, you find out that people are doing things that you would have never actually recorded just by asking them what they're doing. And the same with the kinds of food the food they eat and the kinds of nutrition they have. I've done quite a lot of work on nutritional analysis and food diaries and so forth. And again, you see that what they're doing really often doesn't correspond to the kinds of answers you would get on a traditional household questionnaire. So again, the contribution to environmental management, of course, by understanding people's livelihoods and food security and measuring their responses to changing economic conditions, you can design conservation projects that are actually much more sensitive to local coping strategies. And again, it's relevant to environmental management and conservation in many ways. I've done, actually, as I said at the beginning of this, my dissertation was on human foraging strategies and using foraging theory, optimal foraging theory, to understand the sort of micro-ecological decision-making in foraging across space and time. That involved focal forays, basically following fishermen and fisherwomen for extended periods of time and recording their caloric expenditure, caloric intake, and so forth, and calculating mean net returns for their foraging. And this included, again, also self-reporting diaries, creel surveys. Then we actually mapped a lot of this fishing behavior, GIS, the geographical information systems, to actually spatially conceptualize people foraging patterns, as you see in these pictures, across seasonal variation. One side of the picture, I don't know if it's very clear, looks at the mean return rate per patch, and the other one looks at the mean time allocation per patch per season. But again, in my case, I did more than 920 hours of recorded observation, direct recorded observation, and over 14,000 hours of self-reporting data. And that expanded between 1992 and about 2010, when I actually stopped doing these kinds of analysis, because I burned out of doing all that work. And again, these kinds of information can help you design permanent and seasonal closures, modeled according to seasonal foraging patterns. So you begin to see much more nuanced ways of understanding how people move across the seascape and actually exploit the seascape. And these are kinds of things you don't capture through interviewing, okay? And integrating this kind of stuff into, let's say, MPA design or a spatio-temporal refugia would be of interest and importance to actually have a much more balanced management regime that accounts for actual human foraging versus the resource in question that we're trying to manage or conserve. In this respect, I've done quite a bit of work on women foraging and what they, their exploitation of invertebrates. I'm not going to go into depth, but we did a lot of work and over time in analyzing not only their indigenous knowledge regarding this stuff and testing some of their hypotheses of their knowledge, but kind of comparing these Polymesona and Ricky, I forget, and blood cockles and sort of analyzing what they were doing. And we did an analysis of closed or semi-closed and open areas between the two species of cells, and basically found that the spatial temporal areas we're doing as good as the fully closed areas. So, you know, kind of thinking about biologically and in the terms of human ecology, what are the best regimes to actually implement. Some places you may actually come to the conclusion that a no-take area is the way best to go, but in some instances, I think there's a wider literature, and I think Josh also and others of you have been involved in this. Spatial temporal refuge can, to a certain extent, work successfully to manage certain kinds of invertebrate resources. Again, a lot of work on local indigenous knowledge. What I'm trying to do is not only talk about my work, but I'm giving examples of the kinds of things that you as students or young researchers or not, or any researcher can do in terms of doing these micro scale or local scale studies. And we can address the relevance of that in the questions when we get to that. But you can do a lot of work on indigenous knowledge and GIS. Again, there's a lot of interviewing and participatory mapping and long-term collates of information. Interestingly enough, we just did an analysis that just came out in a paper in ecological indicators, which we compare local knowledge that I collected in the early 90s to now. And we see a very, not only a change in the number of terms that are used to refer to different species, but also how taxonomic distinctiveness has actually changed over space and time. So the grouping criteria that people use to actually group different families of fish within the IMIC or the local perspective has been changing over space and time. Important to do this, and there's no way around this. You need to do long-term research. You know, I often hear people complain, but we know we cannot do like people did before and spend a whole year or 2 years or 3 years. Well, you have to. I'm sorry, because the world is actually, as we all know, entering a very dangerous time in terms of our resource use and its environment. So I think these are the kind of local studies are important, but we'll get back to that in a moment. A lot of combining indigenous knowledge, in other words, using hypotheses to test versus research in marine science. So we've done a lot of work on creel surveys, underwater visual censuses, with Simon, Albert, and others work on interconnectivity studies. So a lot of collaborative work with marine scientists to kind of pair the human ecology with the sort of ecological, biological research of the actual resources themselves. And you know, you get to quite interesting stuff. Some of you may have seen, these are maps of IMIC categories. So this is a map of the benthos, both biotic and abiotic, as per indigenous knowledge. And we've done correspondence studies. I've seen that there's quite a good correspondence between what local people are telling you is there versus what is actually there from a scientific biological perspective. And again, you know, the geospatial analysis has allowed us to understand spatial distribution of habitats and species, and that helped us in designing sort of participatory conservation efforts of marine protected areas. And I would say this very honestly, and I think, you know, a lot of the work we've done in Solomon Islands with marine protected areas has to a certain extent collapsed. So even with very, 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 you know, grounded local studies, you know, that doesn't assure success, and I think we can get back to that in a moment. But again, you know, it's important to do these very sort of localized research studies to understand local dynamics in terms of human environmental interactions. This is just example of more of that, and sort of, you know, themes in the GIF of almost different cognitive categories of indigenous peoples, you know, how they categorize the substrate, locally they identify marine habitats, biological events, fishing sites, floating sites, and larger definitions of each of these layers are themes in the GIS, which represents different spatial forms of knowledge of people's understanding of the environment. And you can do very cool maps about local people's you know, cognition of the seascape, of the cultural seascape, with a certain high level of ecological confidence, mind you. So local people know what's exactly in the underwater. This is sort of a map of all the georeference patches that we've studied. So between myself and some of my grad students over the last, we haven't been doing this is work we did in the early 2000s. But each white patch is an indigenously defined habitat. So we have more than 620 of them, and we have all kinds of information for each of those patches. This is both a spatial, you know, a picture of the Vonavona and Roviana Lagoon in the Solomon Islands. you can do a special query and ask, during the first cycle of the lunar cycle, where would you be likely to catch, certain type of Serenid or Lujanus or whatever. You could actually get spatial visual understanding of that through these kinds of stuff. So interesting stuff for research, for management, and so forth. This is a sort of a closer picture of these patches and the kinds of stuff that for each of these areas we have inventories of species, locally recognized, biological events, the benthos, culture history about them, ownership, and so forth. Again, going back to the same thing, really thinking of cultural seascapes, both, marrying knowledge, marine science, and cultural understanding of the seascape into geographical information systems to kind of display these kinds of different knowledges across space and time. We've done, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've also done a lot of work on indigenous knowledge loss, and I'm not going to get into the details, but the MDS here shows basically that people that are closer to markets, being and older, are much more closer to the master list that I collected in the early 90s in terms of the knowledge of fish names, and younger people and people who are actually closer to markets in this way. These are people who are further from markets, and this is actually an area that Josh has extensively worked in. And here we show very similarly, as Josh has talked about, that people who are closer to markets are losing their indigenous knowledge quicker, and even people who are older are also doing so, and not only young people, but yeah. So anyway, you can do all kinds of stuff at the local scale to see what's going on over space and time with knowledge systems, with behavioral patterns, with a number of different domains of human behavior. In terms of environment and climatic change, again, some of the work that I've been involved on, and this is with Simon Albert at University of Queensland, has been in understanding people's perception of environmental changes across time. We compared 1986 with 2011 to have a 25-year period. We looked at mangrove distribution, we looked at water quality, and then we did, so the top ones are the indigenous knowledge perceptions of those things, and the bottom two pictures are the actual scientific studies in where we actually looked at mangrove distribution across the coastline, looking at water quality over the entire lagoon, and then overall, local knowledge and what people are saying corresponds fairly well with what we find in situ when we did the scientific studies. Again, the same with coral disease and coral bleaching. Mind you, that local people make no distinction between the two, but where they were telling us there was damage in the coral, when we actually did all these underwater surveys to look for bleaching and disease, we found out that a lot of what people were telling us was relatively accurate in terms of the spatial distribution of the disease or damage to coral in general. So again, this is not only to defend local knowledge, but to think about how to, a lot of people talk about local knowledge, but you have to integrate it into your scientific plans. And that requires a lot of thinking and working with different ways and compromising, right? This is some of the work we've done on spatial local knowledge and mapping in Madagascar. Also a situation looking at people's understanding of changes across time. And then this is the time scale of the kind of changes people have seen over space and time of their environment across two villages in southwestern Madagascar. But again, same kind of work. Again, I was talking about marine tourism, and we've done quite a bit on mapping and environmental social impacts of nascent tourism, which now has been completely disrupted by COVID-19. But before, that Munda area, Roviana Lagoon is emerging as one of the eventual hotspots of research in the of tourism in the area. So we knew this years ago, so we began doing some work to look at possibilities of what would happen and basically look at people's perception of disputes over reefs and governance, and we map them through geographical information systems across different villages. So you see all these different villages with different areas. and we kind of mapped the positive, negative response. In some areas they overlapped, and some areas they countered, meaning that one village would see a positive one while the other would see a negative. Why? Because there were counterclaims in terms of governance and territory. So these are kinds of things you would like to know before you start developing some kind of tourism industry, particularly if you're going to offer people access to reefs for entertainment and for experience. You want to make sure local communities are in par in either sharing the benefits or allowing access. So doing this kinds of GIS mapping of people's understanding of, access to resources would be important. Again, this is just a much more detailed map on different villages and their ideas about what would be negative and positive in terms of access to different kinds of resources, islands, bird watching, fishing, and so forth. I'll be done soon, but let me just talk about some other areas we've done work on rapid ecological change and on social ecological analysis. We did pre-tsunami, post-tsunami. So we did before the tsunami by chance, we did indigenous knowledge mapping of a certain area, and we had done a biological survey of the area to see what was actually there. And then the tsunami happened, and it presented an opportunity to see how local people perceive change over time. So we did 2 surveys, both biological and human ecological, across certain years. So we had 2006, 2008, 2007 was the tsunami, Manu. So this is 1 year before the tsunami happened. This is 1 year after. This is 3 years after. And basically what we found out that the directionality of change was identified by all the villages, all the proportions of habitat coverage were difference between the scientific survey versus what local people were telling us. But importantly, the directionality of change was identified in different types of habitat and different types of biotic cover or abiotic, sort of seagrass, sand, and so forth. Again, important stuff to think about when you want to build resilient into socio-ecological systems, basically, which we've heard this from Berkeley's Folke and many others, talking about capacity of learning. And this is important to actually measure and identify. People talk about it, but being able to measure it is quite interesting, because this, of course, enhances adaptive responses and adaptive capacity of communities to adapt to ecological change, brought about by human disturbance of habitats and climate change and so forth. We've also worked with Simon on looking at protected ecological changing fishing over a period of, again, around 16, 17 years. And we see basically that there's been a change in the patterns of fishing, whereas a lot of, drop lining has increased, and trolling and other methods have actually changed. And we found out that the fishermen are actually going farther away and spending more time. So again, measuring these kinds of long-term changes in the seascape. So when we go back to these socio-ecological systems idea, when we look at systems, when we actually, this is sort of a conceptual qualitative model of 2 protected areas, but I'm just trying to show where a lot of the information that I've been talking about would feed into. So when we think about these larger models that can provide us a systemic or systems-wide idea of what's going on the larger scale, at regional scale, or even at that local scale, but we identified it as systems, such as what we would do in socio-ecological systems research. A lot of this information can be plugged into these conceptual models to kind of get a much deeper sense of what's really going on. And I as a researcher, I found out over reading hundreds or thousands of papers that often a lot of the data that goes into these kinds of research are actually very scant or very superficial. So again, I think that these local scale kind of research are important. And the benefits of the conceptual model is that you can upgrade the qualitative model, showing positive, negative impacts across different areas. You can maybe construct eventually, and in this sense, I've been working with Eva Plagani at CSIRO in Australia, as a matter of fact, to try and think how we would construct a quantitative model of current ecosystem services losses and simulating sort of like a post-climate change scenario for projections. There are possibilities here with these kinds of detailed data, and we are still thinking about this and working with different actors. And again, this kind of research is not only for the solo anthropologists to go into the field and do it, but can be done across teams which actually distribute different parts of the research and different parts of this work. So it doesn't need to be the classical, ethnographer that goes into the field like what I did 25 years ago and spend years on the ground collecting these types of data. Again, these are not predictive tools, but just want to highlight how these coastal human ecological data can be integrated to a SES model. And basically integrating these kinds of information into models and analysis increases the number of management levers and probability of success of implementing some kind of management action, okay? This is just a quick picture of sort of the marine protected areas that we developed in the Roviana-Bonavona Lagoon. Most of these are moribund, and the ones that exist are actually not as effective as before, but we can talk about in the discussion. So quickly, there are many social processes that drive the success or failure of environmental programs. And this, of course, we all know, and I'm preaching to the choir, requires a close collaborations between natural and social scientists. Easier said than done. We all talk about it, but we often see that that's really not the case. Although I know that JCU has been extremely successful at that. That's not the case for all institutions across different parts of the world. Again, interdisciplinary social scientists like Che would be are in good position to envision these multiple and comprehensive approaches to ocean conservation, starting from the local level and scaling up. This is why local level research, long-term research is important, because when we want to think about scaling up, you need to have the right data and right understanding what's going on the ground to do so. And as we get deeper and deeper in understanding local processes, we can actually design better hybrid management institutions to take both advantage of customary local behavior and modern governance and conservation systems. And again, we can develop different methodologies to work on this, as I have gone through various ways of doing this kind of stuff. And basically, to conclude, I mean, it's not rocket science, and it's nothing new. Researchers have been saying this for decades and decades and decades, and there's been thousands of papers written on this subject. Basically, we need to build disciplines and approach, bridges between disciplinary approaches, and we all know this. But here in Africa, I work with UCT, Rhodes, BITS, and different universities across the continent. Building these bridges, it's very, very difficult. Anyway. Research has to be actionable. I think it's important that we design our research to have some kind of local impact. And that's pointed by E.O. Wilson in his 1998 book on consilience. Disciplinary consilience is of fundamental importance to address some of the problems we face in the 21st century. And I would advocate for coastal human ecology, as I define here, as being very well equipped for building bridges between the humanities and the natural sciences. Thank you.